Welcome to In the Masters class with your co-host DB Harris. And I say co-host because the spirit is the main host here. And we're all going to be learning from the spirit. Now, I want to start off by explaining to you that this discourse will not be an ordinary discourse. This is going to be an exceptional adventure for all of us. I'll be learning along with you, and we're all going to be learning about the goodness of God and what God has done and is doing in our lives. I'm particularly interested because this this new information will be coming out. Probably some of the things that I'll be talking about you probably have heard of before. When I say new information, it doesn't mean this is new truth. What it means is that it's new revelation. Truth is constant. Truth doesn't change. Truth is always there. What has happened is that we have been discovering more truth as we go, and we become more enlightened, right, as we grow. Um, as far as the question on worship, I think one of the main questions is, how do we worship God? What does God say about worship? Well, there are some things I'm going to be talking about that you might find rather strange or interesting, and that has to do with the fundamentals of worship. Worship is not what you normally think. I'm going to have to excuse myself here because this is going to be a shock to many people. Going to church and doing what you do in a certain building is not worship, is not true worship. What that is a socialization, congregational encouragement for the brethren. There's nothing wrong with that. True worship is a daily living. And how do we attain true worship? There are some first, foremost steps that we have to take. And one of the main understanding is knowing who we are, knowing self. If you don't know who self is, you can't worship. For example, I give you a text that we're going to start out with. The text says, my people perish through lack of knowledge. Hosea 4 verse 6. Now, the issue is God's people perishing because it says my. The word my here is a personalizing of the subject. The subject are people. The subjects are people. And so God is saying that his people perish through because of lack of knowledge. Now, why is this so? Why do they perish through lack of knowledge? And what is this perish that we're talking about? And what is this knowledge? Those are questions that we have to answer. Firstly, let's look at the state that God's addressed these people as. He addressed them as his own. So all of those who are claiming that they are God's people, he's talking about you. He said you perish because of lack of knowledge. Now, a lot of people might say, well, hold on a minute. We have knowledge. We understand life. We have attained education. We have aspired to the greatest. We are prime ministers. We are presidents. We're, you name the different qualification levels where you are. But the question then is that the knowledge that this is talking about? That's the main question. Is it the knowledge, the conventional knowledge of the day? Is it the educational aspiration and where we attain knowledge to be able to function effectively in a certain society? Is that what it's talking about? Well, I'm here to tell you no, that's not what it's talking about. And we're going to allow the Bible to expose which knowledge this is referring to. Of course, we identify that these people are the ones who claim to be God's people, right? So if they claim to be God's people, they should have knowledge, right? Well, this text is saying they don't. Because if they perish, and the reason why they perish because of lack of knowledge, well, it's stating that they don't have the knowledge that they should. Okay, so the Bible, as most serious Bible student will understand, is that the Bible is a coded book. And as such, you have to be able to find the codes and decipher these codes to understand what the Bible is saying in many respects, right? Not only that, the Bible answers its own questions. If you're studying a subject and the subject has to do with something that the Bible considers to be important, relevant, and I say that's because there are some things that are more important than some, right? Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is very important. The fact that God's people are perishing through lack of knowledge. It's very important for us to know what knowledge this is, right? Now, we're going to talk about the perishing aspect of it first because it says, my people, and they talk about perish, and then we talk about the knowledge. So, what does perish means in the context here? And I must hasten to say that we must remember in the discourses that we're going to be having, context is king. Always remember that. Context is king, and languages are his subjects. Context is king, and languages are his subjects. Therefore, whatever the context says, that's what we will go with. Language has to be compliant with context. Therefore, language is not as important as context. So you might know your Hebrew, you might know your Greek, but if you don't understand context, then you're at a loss. All you know are words, but you don't know the meaning of what you're reading or what you're talking about. All right, so let's go back to this. So, what is this perishing? What is this perishing that we're talking about here? He says, my people perish. Well, as I said, the Bible answers itself. Let us look at see what this perish means. Most people, if I ask them what perish means in this context, they will say, well, it means they die, they cease to exist, etc. Well, the fact is that it's a continuous process of perishing, meaning that it's not necessarily death, meaning that this perish is a process that is continuous, it's ongoing, right? So we have to be careful how we're looking at that. So the question then is, how does the Bible answer this question? Or is there an answer there in the scripture? Well, guess what? Yes. And we go to a parable. And we have to understand that parables are stories with common commonalities, or what we call common everyday knowledge that most people are aware of. And those stories are used as an avenue through which spiritual teachings can be achieved, right? And one of such parables is the parable of the three servants. Now, these three servants were granted gifts according to their abilities. One was granted 5, one was granted 2, and one was granted 1, according to their abilities. Now, it's interesting in this parable that the king saw these men doing their regular work, but he noticed how they were operating, and he recognized that they had gifts, or abilities rather. And based on their abilities, he gave them gifts according to their abilities, right? Now, what's interesting is that the king left, and of course, he would have given them instructions that he would come back a certain time, and then they would have to report to him. Upon him coming back, the one who got 5, he reported to the king and told him that, well, I've gained 5 more on my gifts. And the king was very pleased with that. The one who gained 2 did the same. The king was very pleased with that. Well, most interesting is the one who had one. He did something totally different, unlike his abilities. Remember, the king saw his abilities, or his ability, gave him one, and when the king came back, he was very much distraught with the king and proceeded to accuse the king of being, a harsh man who wants to gain from things that he didn't put anything in. In other words, he was saying that the king was expecting a profit, but the king didn't leave a profit with him. Well, what's most important here is to notice that this fellow, what he did, he hid, he went and buried or hid his gift that he got. And would appear based on his accusation of the king that he was very selfish and self-centered, not knowing that the king was not treating him as a common hire. Okay, so why do I say that? Well, traditionally, and even today, you will never give your profit to a hire or to a servant. Mm-mm. You will pay them what they're due and call it a day. But what the king did, in the towards the two that did what they were supposed to do, he gave them each um, the same amount that they went out and worked with. In other words, the one who got five on his talent, he got five. That five that he got, the king gave it to him. The one who got two on his talent, the five, the two that he got, the king gave it back to him. So this is an act of inclusion, meaning that these men now were a part of the king's inner circle or family. Because you only treat family like this with regards to profit. You don't give profit to servants. You give profits to your offspring. And so he considered them to be closer to him than they were before. This third fellow didn't understand that. He was now adopted into the king's family, but he refused. So based on his action, he got nothing in return. As a matter of fact, the king took his talent from him and cast him out. Now, remember now we're talking about perishing. What does perish means? Well, perish means here as we see it, that he did not perform or didn't live or didn't activate the abilities that he had, meaning that he didn't live his purpose. He didn't live in his purpose. And that's what perishing means, to live outside of purpose. Meaning that each person has, and God has given all of us gifts and talents to use. If we don't use these gifts and talents, then we're not operating in our purpose. And this is what happened to this fellow. Also, remember, he was a part of the family. The king had adopted him already. So those of us who are members, or we think that we are members of God's people, I have to remind you that the scripture says, "You perish through lack of knowledge if you do not live in your purpose." So that's what perish means. It's to live outside of purpose. And I know many people are trying to find what their purpose is. Well, your purpose is what you're gifted for. Whatever you're gifted for, that is your purpose. You need to find what those gifts are. Well, as far as education is concerned, you can become educated and help to enhance your purpose. But this contemporary education is not your purpose. Your purpose comes from God. The minute that God created you, and the minute that God put that spirit within that body, He qualified you with your purpose. You just need to find what it is and use it. And so this goes on as we now go to the next question, which is how And or what is this knowledge? What is this knowledge that we're talking about? Well, we start off again now explaining this with a scripture where God says, for those of us who claim to know God and worship God, God says, how can you say you love me if you do not love your neighbor? Because you have never seen me. So you don't know if I exist. But you've seen your neighbor, but you hate your neighbor. So God is asking the question, how can you say that? And then God is answering, because you don't know me, because you're a liar. hmm God says you're a liar because you hate your neighbor. What does that have to do with knowledge? We're getting there. Now, Christ, he comes along and he amplifies what the Father said. And he puts it this way. He said, you must love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, as I said before, the Bible is a coded book. Therefore, we have to understand the codes and try to decipher these codes so we can excavate or take out these gems that are there, gems of truth. And so if you notice that it says that Christ speaking, so that you have to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So there's a qualification to loving your neighbor. Now God says you should love your neighbor, love your brother, before you can love him or even know him. Christ comes and said, okay, but you have to love your brother as you love yourself. Now, how can you love yourself unless you know yourself? So we're talking about knowledge here. Knowing self. It's the first phase or the first step towards knowing God. Why? Well, you have to know self to love self. You can't know or you can't love something without knowing what it is. There's no such thing as love at first sight. It could be a heavy infatuation or a heavy like. After knowing the person, then you might be like, well, okay, I have second thoughts, or oh, now okay, we're good. Now you can say I love. You can really activate that love because now you know the person. It's the same principle here. You can't love self unless you know self. So that's the first step towards worshiping God. You have to know self. And this is what we're going to be talking about. Knowing self. And what is this self? Towards getting to loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Consequently, being able to love God. And so worship God. So this is the statement I have to make. To all those who are into the church and all those who consider themselves to be righteous people, if you don't know yourself, you don't know God. All you're going through is a ritual formality. And it might feel good. It might be, you've been doing this for years. This has been your tradition. But I'm here to tell you that based on the scripture, you have to know self first before you can know God. We will understand, we'll unravel, we'll unearth what that is in the next video. I trust that this has been a blessing to you, and I hope that you're not discouraged at this point, but you're more interested in knowing what it is that is self. Consequently, pointing into the direction of knowing God and loving God as you love your neighbor. So I'll see you in the next